the northern palace of Herod at Masada. We are now located right over here on the upper terrace. Remember that the palace is built on 3 stories, really on the edge of the cliff of the mountain. In order to build the palace, Herod's engineers had to reshape, the mountain, the cliff, in order to create those platforms. And you can see here that the remains that were found here and excavated indicate that each story, on top of each story, there was a different building with a different shape. So we are now located in this area, right in front of this half-rounded terrace, that from it you could see the entire surroundings. You could see the Dead Sea on one side, the Judean desert on the other side, and even far to the north we will be able to see En Gedi, the oasis of En Gedi. Look, I'm suffering from acrophobia. I'm not good with heights, and I can't even imagine or dream what was it to be a worker of Herod the Great while building this palace on top of a cliff that is something like 300 meters above the area below Masada. And I don't know how many workers, maybe unfortunately for them, lost their lives by falling all the way down. We know that the cliff itself is quite narrow, therefore the architects of Herod had to enlarge it by adding more builded areas, like we can see right over here. So we are now located in this part, and then we are going to go all the way down, following some of the original steps that were enabling the Herod, his family, and the visitors to go from one story to the middle one and to the lowest one. We have a very, very detailed and interesting description of Flavius Josephus when he is talking about Masada. And during the 50s of the 1st century of the Common Era, Josephus Flavius, Yosef, son of Matityahu, was actually wandering here in the Judean desert together with a kind of a Jewish monk, somebody who decided to live in the desert. His name was Banos, and Josephus was actually walking on the hills that are west of us, and he was looking at Masada. And one of the things that he's saying when he was looking at the northern palace, of course, he was not able to visit inside. At that time, it was already a small Roman garrison protected by Roman soldiers, but he could have seen it from outside. And he's telling us something very funny. He says that he saw people on the upper stairs, and suddenly it was looking as if they were entering into the rock, into the bedrock, and disappeared. And suddenly he sees them on the lower part. Today, after the excavations, we know that there was here a very sophisticated system of stairs that enabled the people to move from one story to the other. And another very important thing for him was also again to build a kind of large walls, high walls, again to give the privacy to the people that were inside. And we're talking about the really close entourage of Herod, his family, his wives, his children, and maybe his most loyal people. So this is what we're going to do now. We're going to visit each one of the stories, and we'll start right over here on the western wing of the upper story. Again, we can find a very, very impressive floor with a mosaic floor, and you can see here that the design is very similar to the design that we just saw on the large bathhouse. One feature which is very, very important in the arts that we find in Herod's palace, except for one place, is that everywhere you will see designs that are either geometric or floral, meaning that we don't see any images either of humans or animals, birds, and so on. And the reason is, again, it goes to the idea that Herod wanted to present himself again as this kosher king that is following the Jewish law. And one of the basic laws that was really kept strictly during the Second Temple period is the second commandment, meaning thou shalt not make you any graven images. And even in the most private areas in his palaces, we see that he is following this commandment. The only place, and this is really a recent discovery, was found in Herodium. In the small theater that Herod built in Herodium, where he wanted to host Marcus Agrippa, remember, the second in command in the Roman Empire. Actually, he was the son-in-law of the Emperor Augustus. This is the only place, in order to impress him, you can see that the frescoes there in Herodium had this design which has graven images, meaning animals and even humans. But that was probably for a very, very specific purpose for this visit of Marcus Agrippa. The general behavior of Herod, we can see it, was really to follow the Jewish law, even in the places where he was not exposed to the, let's see, the general Jewish society of his time. So I invite you now to enjoy the view and try to imagine again Herod and his guests sitting here in the upper story. Maybe this was actually the place where the living rooms were. So this was really the most private area. And you can ask yourself, maybe he was sleeping in this room or maybe in that room. Maybe some of the rooms belonged to his different wives. Remember, he had eventually 10 wives. I don't know how many stayed here together with him. Maybe he had for each palace in the country a specific wife that could entertain him in that area, in that place. So when we talked about the wine, the imported wine, the apples, the garum sauce, the fish sauce, this is where he had it. This is the place where he could eat it, and not only to eat it, but to eat it by enjoying this amazing view that I invite you to see together with me right over here. So, join me please. Let's see the terrace. So, this is where Herod could actually enjoy the atmosphere of the Judean desert and the Dead Sea. We can see in front of us the northern part of the Dead Sea, which still looks like a lake. To the west of us, we can see the cliffs of the Judean desert. This is actually where we can really be impressed from the breach, okay, the geological breach that creates the rift in which the Dead Sea is located. And when we look to the other side, we can see what today is the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, okay, which in the biblical times, this was the land of Moab and Ammon. And this was actually the eastern frontier of Herod's kingdom. And his closest neighbors, more to the south of us, as we look further to the right, were the Nabateans. Okay, Herod was actually attached to the Nabatean people because his mother was Nabatean. His mother's name was Kippos. Okay, so one part of his family was actually from real foreign, non-Jewish origins. The other branch of the family, his father, Antipater, was actually Jew, but from a family that was converted to Judaism, because the origins of his father's family was from Edom. He was Edomite. And this is another reason why for him it was so important to show that he was well-behaving Jew. Okay, because in order to be the king of Judea and to inherit the Hashmonean kingdom and Hashmonean dynasty, he had to really show himself as a Jew. And we know that in the Jewish society he was blamed to be a foreigner. And how come that the king of Judea is a foreigner? Because again, his family originated from Edomia on one hand, from his father's side, and from the Nabatean, from Arabia on the other side. And that also explains why we can see in his palaces, like here in Masada, that he was actually, it was for him very important to show that he was following the laws of the Jewish Torah, like it is supposed or expected from a Jewish king. Another point that we can see right in front of us, if you can see right over there, there is a green spot. That is the oasis of En Gedi. And En Gedi is a very, very important site. First of all, because it's one of the closest areas where you can find water. So again, if you don't have enough water in Masada, you can always go and find water in En Gedi, but I still owe you the explanation how they got the water here. But En Gedi is important in the second phase in the history of Masada, when the Jewish rebels found refuge here on top of the mountain. We read in the books of Josephus that at a certain moment in the year 68, okay, so more than 2 years after the outbreak of the rebellion against the Romans, the rebels here at Masada are going to En Gedi, and they actually attack the village and take spoil, kill people there, Jews, and take spoil back to Masada. And in a recent research by one of the archaeologists here in Israel, Professor Guy Stiebel, he actually talks about a new idea why actually the Romans eventually came to Masada and conquered it, although there were here only less than 1,000 people that were finding refuge here. And his explanation was that the reason why the Jews attacked En Gedi in the year 68 was because En Gedi was a very, very rich village. And why is that? Because this was one of the places where there were plantations of a very, very important and precious plant known as the balsam, from which perfumed oils were produced. And probably one of the sources for the richness and the fact that Herod was so wealthy was maybe because of the production of this plant here in the area of the Dead Sea, En Gedi and Jericho, and from here it was actually exported to the entire Roman world. And there was such a demand for it that the sources say that the price of it was equal to the price of gold. Okay, so maybe the reason why the rebels here in Masada attacked En Gedi was because of the fact that En Gedi was so rich with those commodities, and the rebels wanted to enjoy from it. Looking down, we can see the middle story of the northern palace, and even the farthest end of the lowest one. And this is where I'm going to take you right away, as we're going to go down and visit those lower wings of one of the most remarkable palaces built by Herod in Judea. So we are located now in the middle story of the northern palace of Herod at Masada. And you can see above me the cliff, the natural cliff. The height between us here and the terrace that we just saw on the upper story is 20 meters. And from here, we have to go down still 13 meters in order to reach the lowest level. It means that from the highest point to the lowest point, we're talking about 33 meters of altitude. You can see just behind me right here remains of the original stair system that allowed the people to go down from the upper stage to the middle one. And on our way down, we're going to see and actually use the original system. This again explains the phenomena that Josephus is describing while he's watching Masada from the west, how people actually entered into the rock, disappeared, and suddenly appeared in the lowest point. One of the most impressive features in the middle story is, of course, the bases of a round building. We can see here actually two concentric walls that were the base of that building that we saw before in the model of the Northern Palace. And here you have again to use your imagination and try to see here right in front of us a rounded building, maybe with a conical shape, what is known in the classical terminology Tolus building, that is known to us both from the Roman world of that time and even before in the Hellenistic period, and specifically also in Herod's building projects. For example, in Herodium, at Herodium, in the lower Herodium, where Herod constructed a very, very large pool of fresh water, in the middle of this large pool there was like a small island, and the island also had this round shape, and probably on top of the base, the rounded base, there was also a similar building. Such buildings, Tolos buildings in the classical world, are known also in funerary architecture, meaning that they were built for remains of deceased. Actually here at Masada we do not know exactly what was the purpose of the middle story. One can think of maybe a very, very impressive hall, rounded hall with pillars surrounding it, and from the openings you actually could sit and see what happens all around you. Again, the scenery of the Dead Sea, the Judean desert, and the Moab mountains on the other side of the Dead Sea. One theory talks about maybe a library that was here, or maybe a dining hall. So again, we can imagine Herod sitting here with his guest, enjoying from this excellent wine, having the apples and other yummy and good things, enjoying the beautiful scenery, and also especially maybe not in the hottest days of the year, but in winter time, this was the perfect place maybe for recreation, leaving the cold areas of the central hill country, especially Jerusalem, and having here a nice weekend or a winter vacation. So what we're going to do now, we're going to continue all the way down, and on our way we're going to meet the original stair system, and eventually we will find ourselves in the lowest part of the Northern Palace. So let's continue. Now descending from the middle floor of the palace, of the Northern Palace, to the lowest floor, and pay attention that I'm now walking on modern wooden stairs, but right over here I'm stepping and I'm descending on stone, on rock, and this is actually part of the original stair system that was leading from the middle story to the lowest one. And pay attention to the blocks here, which are covered with original plaster, which shows us that we are actually inside a building of stairs, a staircase, and the stairs are actually surrounding a middle pillar, which is right in front of me, and this was the way to go all the way up. So if we go back to the explanation of Josephus about what he saw at Masada, that people are entering from one end of the palace, disappearing, and then turning out from the lower part, this system explains it. There is a theory that this kind of stair system was adopted from Nabatean architecture, and we have to remember that we are located far away from the Nabatean front, the Nabatean border. Therefore, it's very easy to explain how those influences actually penetrated and entered into the realm of Herod's kingdom here in the Judean desert at Masada. So let's continue now all the way down to the lowest part of the palace. Follow me. So here we are. It's amazing to hear the silence. And I can imagine Herod sitting here, drinking a cup of wine, watching the surrounding, and enjoying from the silence. We are now maybe in one of the most impressive parts of the northern palace. You can see here the original pillars that were part of the central hall that was the main building of the lowest story of the palace. We are still something like 300 meters above the bottom, which is right below us. And pay attention here to the rock. In this case, we're not talking about dolomite that we saw upstairs. This is sandstone, which is also a rock that you can find not far away from here. But a very interesting thing that can be seen here is that the sandstone is covered here with this white material, and this is plaster. And this plaster right over here is actually imitating marble. If we go back to the description of Josephus, when he talks about the palaces of Herod, he's talking about palaces that were built from white stone, or sometimes in the Greek it says from marble. Today we know that at the time of Herod the Great, marble was not imported yet to Judea. Marble was imported to Judea only later in the late Roman period by the empire. But what Herod was doing in his palaces and in his building projects was to imitate marble by actually covering the limestone or the sandstone with plaster, with white plaster, thus creating the image that we're talking about, pillars that are all built as monoliths, as one rock, and they were all made of marble. So this is like a fake marble, but something which is very, very typical to the building techniques used by Herod's architect, and we see them not only in Masada, we see them also at Herodium, we see it also in Caesarea, in the promontory palace on the seashore, and this is something very, very typical. So again, a very, very beautiful example showing us how much Herod wanted to build in the same style, in the same technique as in the central part of the empire in Rome itself. And it doesn't matter if he's doing it in Caesarea, in Jerusalem, or here in the most farthest area, the most remote palace in his kingdom, here at Masada. Let's go inside the main hall now. So the distance in altitude, the difference in altitude between where we are staying now and the upper terrace, where we had the entire scenery around us, is 33 meters. Okay, that was the difference. And here again you can see the magnitude and the ingenuity of Herod's vision and Herod's engineers and architects, how they could actually accomplish it. And this is another very, very interesting feature in the thought of Herod. And also he was actually not inventing it. It was part of the Roman concept of building. When you build monumental buildings, sometimes you want to show how you actually overcome the nature. So if in Caesarea is actually building a palace that is penetrating deep into the sea, here at Masada we saw how he reshapes the mountain, the rock, thus creating those three different platforms, and he's adding more structures in order to get this wide space, in order to construct those big halls, big impressive halls, and they are all decorated in the most modern way, in the most modern technique that we find in the Roman world. And pay attention to what we see here again. You can see the pillars that are actually touching the rock, and you see that they are again covered with plaster, and here you can see very well how this plaster is imitating marble pillars, as if it was built from marble. And here also on the upper part we can see Corinthian capitals. These are Corinthian capitals typical of Herod's time, and what's interesting here is that we can see a kind of influence again from the Nabatean world. Another amazing thing that was found here by the archaeologists already in the time of the excavation by Yigael Yadin are the designs of the fresco right here at the bottom, and also on the wall itself, on the plaster. So we already saw this design of the first Pompeian style, which is actually like imitating slabs of marble in different colors. But what we can see here is another design, which is actually showing a kind of imitation of the natural shape of the marble. And it can be seen here and also on the other side of the central hall of the lower story. Of course, these were all reconstructed, but they are based on material that was found again at the bottom of the ruins when this entire area was excavated. Standing now on the southeastern part of the lowest story of the palace, of the northern palace, and actually I'm floating on air. Okay, this is of course a modern construction, which is actually located on top of what used to be the private bathhouse of King Herod in the northern palace. When Yadin's excavators were working here in the 60s, they actually found here remains of the structures of that private bathhouse, different from the large bathhouse that we saw before. In this case it was much smaller, much more private. Of course, it was really directly used by him and his closest family. What was found here were the remains of the hippocaust, meaning the bases of the pillars that were holding the two floors for the warm air, and also the frigidarium. What was absent here was the tepidarium, okay, the tepid water, and also the changing room. But that can be explained, of course, because of the fact that we're talking about his personal toilet in the palace. Unfortunately, since this was all built on the edge of the cliff, because of the damage that was caused here during the crushing the rebellion in the year 73. And because of the earthquakes, this part of the palace actually collapsed downwards. What's important also about the lowest part of the palace was that this is the place where the archaeologists found remains of skeletons of a woman and two girls, and also a piece of hair, which probably belonged to victims of the rebellion when the Romans actually took Masada. So a very, very dramatic find was found right here where we are standing now. So I'm standing now in the northern part of the casemate wall. Remember, that is the wall that is surrounding the entire plateau of Masada, of Mount Masada, and was originally built by Herod. Also to protect the mountain, but probably mainly to give some kind of privacy to the dwellers in the mountain. And I'm now walking in one of the rooms, one of the casemates in that wall, and you see that I'm standing in front of an opening that is actually leading to nowhere. If I'm looking downwards, I can see the cliff, the very, very steep slope that goes all the way down, something like 300 meters below. Right in front of me, towards the north, I can see the three platforms of the northern palace that we just saw. So how come that we have here this room with two openings, one to the inner part of the mountain and the other one to the cliff? Actually, I'm standing now in the water gate of Masada. No, I'm not looking for a president and all kinds of corruptions, but this was actually the place from which a path was going down all the way to the cistern, to the 12 cistern that we just saw downstairs. And from here, they were bringing the mules that were carrying the jars filled with water, or the tanks made of leather. And from here, they were getting inside Masada and putting the water inside the cisterns that were on top of the mountain. So this is one of the water gates of Masada. Actually, this is the second one. The original one was located a few meters to the east of us, and it was the same way to carry the water all the way down. So if we go back to the commander of the mountain that we saw his house, his villa, in the beginning of our tour, one of his main responsibilities was actually to make sure that during the entire year, the water from the cistern below would be carried to the top of the mountain in order to fill the water cisterns on the mountain itself, so that at any time, at any moment, especially in emergency, there will be enough water on the mountain, on Masada, to provide water for the northern palace and the other installations and buildings at Masada. So let's continue. I'm standing now on top of one of the 13 water cisterns, huge water cisterns, on the plateau of Masada. What we see here is not the original cistern, because you can tell that the entire roof of it collapsed. So it looks like now as a huge cave, but originally this entire opening was closed. It means that the rock was hewn here. The material, the rock, was removed from here and probably was used for the constructions, for the buildings on Masada. And then the space, the opening, was covered with thick hydraulic plaster, as you can see on the back of the cistern. And in that way, it could have been filled with fresh water. What's interesting about this cistern is that you can see here a small pool with stairs, and probably the water was carried here, filling the small pool, and from here the water continued and filled the big cistern. What was the reason? Because the small pool probably was used as a kind of filter in order to make sure that the water entering into the cistern was as clean as possible. Downstairs, we saw how they actually collected the water from the floods. Remember that the water that filled the lower cisterns was flood water, that the flood was carrying actually everything from the streams of the Judean desert, okay, in the stream of Masada and the stream of Ben Yair. And it was very important to make sure that the water that eventually or finally reached its way and found its way here to the cisterns on top of Masada were as fresh and clean as possible. So imagine that when we talk about the cisterns on top of Masada, we're talking about cistern with a capacity of something like 12,000 cubic meters, and together with the cistern down, okay, the 12 cisterns down the hill, the overall capacity is 48,000 cubic meters. That's a huge amount of water. But we saw before in the model and also the cisterns below that such a capacity of water, of flood water, reached eventually when the streams of the Judean desert were flooded during the rainy season. We are located now right here on the northwestern corner of Masada, of the plateau. Right here we can see the complex of the northern palace with the 3 terraces. How did they bring all that water that was so needed in order to live here in the middle of the desert? That was the main challenge of the engineers of Herod the Great. What you can see here in the model is this path that goes all the way down from the water gate, down the slope, okay? So it's very similar to the snake path on the other side of Masada. And you see that eventually it reaches this aqueduct right over here. This aqueduct is filling a series of cisterns with water that came from the floods in the Judean desert. Remember that I told you that Josephus is telling us that when Herod arrived to Masada for the first time with his family, there was like a miracle that there was a rain shower that filled the cisterns on top of Masada. I'm sure that this event made it clear for Herod that he should take care to provide enough water in order to really be able to stay here and to fortify Masada in a time of crisis. So the idea was to build here 2 aqueducts that were actually collecting the floods of the rain from 2 areas here. One is the stream of Masada, and the other one is the plateau which is right in front of us to the west. And when the floods arrived here, actually the aqueducts collected the water and filled the 12 cisterns that were hewn on the slope of the mountain. So I want to now demonstrate it with this very fine model, and you can see, you can imagine that we have here two lakes that were created by two dams that were collecting the water, leveling them up. And once the water were high enough, actually imagine here how the aqueducts are now filled with water and how they are moving the water into the cisterns. Okay, so we have 8 cisterns on the upper level and the 4 cisterns on the lower one. Okay, in a moment we're going to see the cisterns and the aqueducts, parts of the aqueducts that were leading the water into them. So this explains how come that we have the capacity of 36,000 cubic meters in the lower cisterns and another 12,000 cubic meters on top of the plateau, and that includes also the first cistern that we saw in the beginning of our tour before we entered via the main gate. So let's go now and see the lower cisterns and the aqueducts. Sitting here in one of the most interesting and intriguing buildings at Masada. You can see that the building is actually almost square, and all around the walls are benches that are situated like stairs. This building is believed to be the famous synagogue of Masada, built by the rebels during the Grand Revolt against Rome. And this might have been the place in which Elazar, son of Yair, the leader of the rebels here on Mount Masada, on the last evening before the Romans breached the walls and stormed into Masada, gave the speech that is documented by Josephus, where he's giving the men, the heads of the families, 2 options. One option is to surrender, maybe be executed and for surely enslaved by the Romans as a punishment. And the second one is to remain free and commit suicide, thus to die as liberated men. Eventually, according to Josephus, they took the second option, and the tragic end of this rebellion here was that the men actually slaughtered their family, and the last one, who was picked by a lottery, eventually committed suicide. He was the only one to actually kill himself, and thus when the Roman legion, headed by Flavius Silva, entered Masada, everything was silent, and the only thing that the Romans could see here are piles of corpses of the rebels that decided to die free as free men and not be captured by the Romans. When Yigael Yadin excavated this building, he found that actually there were here 2 stages, and probably the original building looked a bit different. It had also pillars in the middle that they were ordered like in the shape of the letter Chet in Hebrew, like a table, let's say. And later on, the rebels modified the building. They placed the columns in the places where we see them today, and also built the seats that are all around the middle, the center. And actually, this is one of the 7 synagogues that we know today that existed during the time of the Second Temple, which is a very, very interesting phenomena, because today we know in Judaism that actually the synagogue is a kind of a memory or a replacement of the lost temple in Jerusalem, Thus, for example, the three daily prayers that every Jew is praying every day, each one of them commemorates one of the three sacrifices, daily sacrifices in the temple. What existed here before the rebels modified the building into a synagogue? That's still a big enigma. There is one option, one suggestion, saying that originally Herod built here a stable for horses, maybe the mules that were, some of them bringing the water from the cistern below through the water gate into the cisterns. But there is another idea saying that maybe already in the time of Herod, the early building also served as a synagogue, although the plan of it, the shape of it, is very, very unique, and we don't know any similar building or synagogue that was looking like this. But again, maybe that was another example for Herod wanting to show he's a devout Jew, and maybe for the personnel serving here in Masada, there was also a building, but this is still in a big debate. The common view is that originally there was here a stable. So a very, very important building with a very dramatic event that probably is marking or symbolizing the last part of the second phase in the history of Masada, when the rebels that were taking refuge here after the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the Second Temple actually are staying here, and here they are actually gathering and deciding the last very, very heroic, maybe some would say, thing that they did here in order to keep their freedom. One of the towers, the 27 towers that surround the entire plateau, that are part of the casemate wall that we already saw. But there is a very interesting feature here. We can see that the walls of this building are all filled with those niches, which indicate that this building, this tower, was actually used as a place to graze pigeons or doves, what is known in the classical world as a columbarium. And we have several columbariums or columbaria throughout the country. Why was it important to graze pigeons here at Masada? First of all, we know in general that pigeons were sacrificed in temples, both pagan temples, but also in the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. The second reason, and maybe most relevant here, was that the excrement of the pigeons was used as a fertilizer in order to fertilize and improve the quality of the earth, of the dirt. And specifically here at Masada, we know that the plateau was used in order to cultivate fields, to grow vegetables, maybe fruit trees, part of the provisions given in the palaces, in the northern palace and also in the western palace that we're going to meet in a moment. Maybe another reason that those columbaria were used here at Masada, and we know at least of 3 of them, is that maybe during the time of the rebels, they could have used them as pigeons for the mail in order to send messages. And this could have been also relevant maybe to the people of Herod. So already in the original phase in the history of Masada, the pigeons maybe were part of the royal post, and in order to deliver messages, they were releasing them from here, maybe to Jerusalem, to Caesarea, to other parts of the world. So we have at least 2 or 3 reasons why it was important to graze here pigeons. about to enter into another palace that was built here at Masada, the Western Palace, which we saw in the first model. And here we can see a model of it. You can see that we are very, very close to the casemate wall with two towers. So we are in the western part of Masada. And here we can see this complex of a very large building that was actually built in several phases, actually maybe 3 or even 4 phases. The core of the palace is found right here, together with a very, very impressive opening, which reminds us also what we saw in the villa of the commander of the mountain at the beginning of our tour. So what is so interesting about this palace? First of all, if Herod invested so much energy and money to build the northern palace, which is really the most impressive building at Masada, why do we have the western palace? So one theory is saying that Masada was a place where Herod could invite guests, maybe foreign guests, maybe his friends from the Roman world, and have them here at Masada. For sure, I'm sure he didn't want to share his bed and his most private rooms in the northern palace, so maybe the reason was to build like a palace for the guest at Masada. But there is another theory which is related to this building, saying that maybe this is one of the earliest buildings built at Masada before even the northern palace was completed. And one of the interesting things about the Western Palace is that if we compare its plan, especially the plan of the core of the palace, the beginning of it, we see that it is very, very similar to the plans of 2 Hashmonean palaces that were built at Jericho, not far, 1 hour drive from here northwards. And why is this important? Because Josephus is telling us that the beginning of the history here at Masada, or the history starts not with Herod, but during Jonathan the Hashmonean. Now, who is Jonathan the Hashmonean? The first candidate might be the brother of Judah Maccabeus, one of the 5 sons of Matityahu, the leaders of the Maccabean revolt against the Seleucids in the 2nd century. But we have another Jonathan in the Hashmonean line, and this is of course Alexander Jannaeus. Alexander Jannaeus minted coins, and by the way, dozens of coins, around 70 coins were found here at Masada from his time. And on the coins we have his Greek name, Alexander, but on the other side we have in Hebrew letters the name Jonathan. So we know that this was actually his Hebrew name. So there is one possibility saying that maybe the first buildings at Masada, including maybe the first cisterns, were built already during the Hashmonean period, during the time of Alexander Jannaeus. And that actually could explain why in the story of Herod's family and Herod's arriving to Masada after fleeing from Jerusalem, they find here the cisterns, and there were here rain showers, and the cisterns were filled. So you cannot explain this event of existing cisterns without thinking about somebody who was here before. And again, according to Josephus, it was Alexander Jannaeus who was the first builder. Unfortunately, until now, we don't have any pottery from that period of time. So it's still a big question mark. Was Masada inhabited during the Hashmonean period? What we're going to see right now inside the palace are different phases in its evolution, but mainly we're going to focus on this part, on the first part of the first phase of the palace, with very, very remarkable architectural elements that are all probably from Herod's time. So let's go, follow me. We're about now to enter into the compound of the Western Palace at Masada, and right in front of us we see part of the corridor, very, very long corridor, which actually was built in a later phase of the history of the palace. But here again we can see another example of the art and architecture, the Herodian art and architecture here at Masada, what you can see here is a very, very thick layer of plaster, but you can see that the plaster is actually imitating very large blocks of stone. So what Herod wanted to show us here, that actually we are entering into a corridor which was all decorated with marble slabs. But these are not marble slabs, this is actually fake slabs that are actually of the corridor and the entrance into the Western Palace. So we are now in the core of the Western Palace. I'm standing in front of the inner court, the patio of the palace. And here you can see an element that we already saw in the beginning of our tour when we visited the villa of the commander of the mountain. Remember, we had those two pillars in the middle, in between the two pilasters that are here in the wall. And here you can see an original one that was reconstructed, but we can still see the original plaster. And this might have been what is called the throne room, the entrance into the throne room of the palace, which is situated right over here, again between two square columns. This unit of the palace again was the first one, the earliest one, and from here the palace developed mainly northwards. Another section of the palace is situated right over here, which was also a bathhouse. And this is the next thing that we're going to visit, and we're going to admire some of the really beautiful elements that were preserved here, maybe the most beautiful mosaics in the entire site of Masada. So follow me, let's go. I want to show you something very special that was found here. We're entering into the logistic wing of the Western Palace. Here, right to the left, you will be able to see another warehouse, very similar to the ones that we saw in the Northern Palace, but this one belongs to the Western Palace. And right over here, at the end of this corridor, we're entering into another room. And again, you can see the reconstruction line everywhere. But what was preserved here, a very, very rare find, and what you can see here, we are looking at a stove. Okay, this was a cooking installation. The lower part was filled with wood to create the fire, the heat, and on top of the holes that you see here, they were laying cooking pots in order to cook soup or stew or any kind of delicious food that they could make here. At this corner, we can see the remains, the lower part of an oven to bake bread. The original shape was looking like a small igloo. The top is missing, of course. And again, here at the bottom, they would heat it with wood, and they would stick the bread, the pita bread maybe, on the edges of the inner part. And in that way, they could have the bread together with the soup and other nice things that they were cooking here. The big question is, did this belong to the original Herodian palace, or maybe it was used by the rebels after Herod's time? This is still an open question, and who knows, maybe in the future we'll have good answers for that. So let's go and have a bath now in the bathhouse of the Western Palace. standing now on the second story of the Western Palace in the northeastern wing of the core of the first palace. And just below me, on the first story, we have remarkable remains of the bathhouse that belonged to that palace. Probably, maybe originally it was serving Herod himself, but maybe later on, after the building of the northern palace, the Western Palace was hosting Herod's friend and other visitor that were allowed to stay here at Masada. Just below us we can see now one of the mosaic floors. And usually when we see mosaic floors in buildings from the Second Temple period, they are attached to water installations, meaning bath tubes, and so on. The reason is that usually the rooms were either covered with plaster or sometimes even with dirt. But in places where you had water, you didn't want to create actually mud. So that was the reason why we see those mosaic floors. Some of them are quite simple with even very, very minimal decoration. But in this case, you can see a very beautiful geometric design, which shows us in the middle a rosetta, a flower, and also an element of waves that are in the edges of the design. It's interesting because those elements are found in many of the buildings from Herod's time and also later in the later phase of the Second Temple period. And we find them also, for example, in Jerusalem, in the Jewish quarter, in the houses, the manors that were excavated already in the early 70s in Jerusalem, in the Old City. We can see very similar bathhouses or bathrooms that are inside villas that belong to Jews. And we see here again the idea that Herod is keeping the second commandment, and the images and the designs of the mosaic floors are all either floral or geometric, but no you won't find any shape of an animal or human. I want to show you now another part of the bathhouse with a bath tube, which is located right over here. Right below me, down here, we can see another room of the bath house. You can see here a very, very simple design. 2 squares, concentric squares on the mosaic floor. What is interesting here, you can follow the reconstruction line, the black line, and you can see here that the bottom part of it, in this wall, a small window was preserved. So this is a beautiful example to show us in a very rare instances where we have remains of windows, and you see again the very, very thick wall, and the window, which is very narrow, it allows some light penetrate and light the room, but it is avoiding massive heat entering into the building. So in that way you have a very, very nice condition. Another interesting thing that you can see here is the bath tube, which is attached to the wall right to the right of us. So again, water was brought here from the cisterns. You could have filled the bath tube, and one person could stay inside. It's very interesting to see also the pipeline that from which the bath tube was filled from the adjacent room, which is to the south of us, to the right. I want to show you now one of the most remarkable mosaic floors that was preserved here at Masada, which is located right below me. And it is also part of the bathhouse of the Western Palace. So looking downstairs, we can see almost half of the mosaic, maybe 1/3 of it, and you can see how beautifully it is decorated. Again, we can see the geometric patterns, including triangles at the edges. We have this red frame, and the wave motive. And then we have the meander, which is a kind of a curving line. And then we have in the center the floral motifs, including laurels, and we have even the lilies, the lily flowers that belong to the central round or central round design. What is also visible here is the infrastructure of the mosaic floor. You can see that preserved are the stones, the small stones on which the plaster was laid. And on top of the plaster, of course, when it still was wet, the artist would have placed the tiny stones, each one in different colors. And the idea was that he was following the pattern that was already designed on the plaster. So it was very, very delicate piece of art. And we have even some hints saying that maybe Herod was actually bringing special artists that were working both on the mosaic floors, on the plasters, on the walls, and he brought them from outside the country. Some of them might have come directly from Rome. On top of the watchtower, south of the Northern Palace complex, I want to sum up the day with you. It was a pleasure touring with you in this remarkable site of Masada. We saw the magnificent building, the architectural elements, the Roman techniques that were introduced to the country by Herod the Great. We saw the few modifications made by the rebels that were here at Masada. And all this is open waiting for you. So I hope that next year, with God's help, I'm going to see you all here in the Holy Land, in the land of Israel, and here in the site of Masada. So until then, I wish you all the best. Take care, be healthy. בשנה הבאה בירושלים.